Amen.
Amen.
Well, tonight we're going to have two talks, and we'll have a break in between. Notice in the room with the copy machines, our sort of lobby room, there's all sorts of books. Most of those are written by Jim, some by his friends, but they're all very good. And so if you're interested, see him to pay for them. We have coffee and cookies in there as well, so that's all there. I was going to give Jim a big introduction, but I will read from his Festschrift, and that is a word for a book of scholarly essays written in someone's honor. And so Jim has a book of essays all for him. And this is from the editor of First Things magazine, which some of you have heard of. It's an evangelical and Roman Catholic magazine that talks about religion and politics. And this is what their editor had to say about Jim. It says, James B. Jordan is remarkable. Who else writes detailed interpretations of the book of Daniel and quotes Alan Tate's poetry? Who else can give a lecture on echoes of Leviticus in the apocalyptic vision of Zechariah, and then chat over cigars about Friedrich von Hayek and Richard Weaver? Moreover, who can cover such a range of vivid images, punchy taglines, and memorable turns of phrases? Not many, which is why I've come to think of Jim Jordan as one of the most important Christian intellectuals of our day. High praise from Rusty Reno. I wanted to give Jim a little bit more personal description, though. And so I said, Jim is what would happen if Meredith Kline and R.J. Rushdoony could have ever gotten along with each other. High church iconoclast. Jim teaches us liturgy. He teaches us psychology. He makes us laugh. And he can talk about sci-fi. Jim knows more about the Bible than anyone I ever know. And so we are happy to have James Jordan tonight talk about Joseph from the book of Genesis. And he will start us off now.
Well, that's a description of the other James Jordan. Not entirely. And very few of the books out there are actually by me. I wrote them all, but they're not all under my own. I was asked to talk to you about Joseph and his multicolored dream. Joseph in the book of Genesis. And tonight we're going to lead into that. Tomorrow I want to talk about, in Sunday school, Joseph and his brothers. And then in the sermon, Joseph and Pharaoh, which is kind of a reverse of the order I do it, but you have Sunday school first. So we'll do it that way because the Pharaoh material makes a better sermon. Tonight what we're going to do is talk about Joseph's ancestry, and then we're going to talk about Joseph's double, his twin brother, so to speak, Judah, who was the same age and whose story in Genesis 38 is parallel to the story of Joseph and sheds a lot of light. So we're exploring the themes here tonight. The Joseph narrative occupies chapter 37 to 50. So there's no way we could even read that amount of material and talk and comment on it as we went in the time available. What I want us to do is think back to the very beginning of the Bible, where we have the three falls or the three great sins of humanity. And these are rebellion against the father in the garden, murder of the brother in the land, and intermarriage with the pagans in the world. It's Adam who steals from God the Father and rebels against God the Father. And the punishment for that is death. Adam is brought under death, and the entire world is under death for 4,000 years until the resurrection of Jesus. In a sense, nobody's really alive in the Old Testament period. They're just kind of being jacked up all the time. But resurrection hasn't come until Jesus is raised from the dead. And Adam brings the world under judgment, and there's no justification. There's just kind of little forgivenesses that come along the way until Jesus comes and justification arrives in history. If you know anything about current controversies, you'll realize that I just took a side on certain issues. But justification is something that really arrives in history with Jesus and his resurrection. Before that time, it's just kind of there by anticipation. Well, the first sin, then, is in the garden. It's in the area of worship, and it consists of rebellion against the Father. The second sin, after Adam and Eve were put out of the garden, they're living in the land, and it's an association of brothers. And we have the story immediately of Cain and Abel, and Cain's murder of Abel. And God's statement beforehand to him, you're going to have to wrestle with sin. If you don't successfully wrestle with sin, you're going to fall more seriously. And so the judgment that comes upon Cain might have been a death penalty, and later on in history it will be. But it's to be sent even farther away from the Garden of Eden into a land of wandering. And Cain goes out and builds a city with all the people that he had. How could he build that city? Because Cain's murder of Abel happened when those two boys were about 100, 105 years old. It was right after that Adam and Eve gave birth to their next son, Seth. So you see that when Cain and Abel had their big sacrifices, there were lots of people around. You know, their kids and their grandkids and their great-grandkids, and God's rejection of Cain was a big public event, humiliating. And when Cain went out, he took a lot of people with him to build his city. So we already have civilization going on there. Then we come to the third sin. Now men are living in the world. Now there are two groups of people in the world. One are angels of God who dwell in the heavenlies. But those angels of God came down from heaven and intermarried with the daughters of men. And the result was powerful, wicked men. Now, those angels, that word in Hebrew is the word messenger. And they were in the heavens because their lifespans corresponded to the movements of the planets in the sky. And so that's why you get this myth about spirit angels coming down, intermarrying with women. It means God's appointed messengers left their first estate, intermarried with the daughters of Cain, and the result was they took the energy of the Holy Spirit and they gave it to the pagans, and the result was a civilization full of violence that came and God destroyed in the flood. And you may remember that after the flood, God said the same thing he said before the flood. He said, the imagination of man's heart is only wicked continually, so I'm going to wipe them out in the flood. And after the flood, he said, the imagination of man's heart is only wicked continually, but I'm not going to bring a flood again. I'm going to start doing something more profound about this. And we have the story of the Tower of Babel, where men decided to try to prevent themselves from moving out and taking dominion over the world. They built a false worship tower, and they built a false city. And God comes down and judges the tower and the city, and people are spread abroad. And then we have in Genesis 3 stories that answer 3 historical narratives of things that really happened, that answer the 3 falls that take place. The first story is the Abraham story. And if you read the Abraham story, Abraham is always building altars and leading people in worship. Everywhere Abraham goes, we read that he is dealing in worship. And Abraham, as you may know, Abram means big daddy. Okay? And so it's all about fatherhood here. And in chapter 12 of Genesis, Abram, we read, verse 7. The Lord appeared to Abram and said, to your descendants I will give this land. So he built an altar there to Yahweh who appeared to him. Then he proceeded from there to the mountain on the east of the house of God, Bethel, and pitched his tent with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. And there he built an altar to Yahweh and called upon the name of Yahweh. And at the end of chapter 13, it says he moved his tent and came and dwelt at the oaks of Mamre, which are in Hebron. And there he built an altar to the Lord. Abram is always going around building altars, leading people in worship, converting people, as we'll see a little bit later on in tonight's message, this first message. Okay? Abram is concerned with worship. He's rebuilding a garden in a little way. And we see what we call oasis sanctuaries connected with Abraham. He builds an altar next to a tree where there's a well of water. Okay? A well of water, a tree, and an altar. Those 3 things. Now, if you take those trees and you just chop them down and make planks out of them, and you take that well of water and you put it in a brass basin, and you put the altar here of bronze, you've got the tabernacle. So this is the original sort of oasis sanctuary that Abram sets up. Places of worship all around the land. And he relates to God as a father, and God tells him he is the human image of fatherhood. He's Abraham, the great father. That's what the story of Abraham will be about. And there's nothing in the Abraham story about conflict with a brother or with other people, very little. And there's nothing in there about intermarrying with foreign women. It's true, he has a child by Hagar, but Hagar is the maid of Sarai, his wife. And so that's not a major theme there. The major theme with Abraham is trusting God in worship situations. And he proves to be successful in that. As you'll remember, the last thing that God really told him to do is that I want you to build an altar up on Mount Moriah, and I want you to take Isaac, and I want you to sacrifice him on that altar. That's the big test in the area of worship. And Abraham passes the test. If we move to the story of Jacob, you may say, what about Isaac? Isaac is really the son in the Abraham story and the father in the Jacob story. So the next big story in Genesis is the story of Jacob. And what's that about? Is it about building altars? No. Is it about brother-brother fights? Oh yeah. Fighting in the womb. Jacob and Esau are fighting right from before they were even born. Before it's all over, Rebekah has tricked her husband into doing what God wants them to do. And so after Isaac wakes up to his folly, he calls Jacob in and blesses him with full consciousness in Genesis chapter 27. And Esau says what? He says, I'm going to kill him. And so they send Jacob away so that Esau won't kill him. This brother-brother conflict is a big deal. And Jacob goes into the land of Paddan Aram, and he meets his uncle Laban, and he falls in love with his cousin. And Laban decides that he can really get a lot of good work out of Jacob. You can work 7 years for Rachel, and then after tricking him into sleeping with Leah, you're officially legally married to Rachel, but you slept with Leah, so you're stuck with both of them. It's probably the only accidental case of polygamy in history. So, after 7 days, Jacob takes Rachel as well, but he has to work 7 more years for her. And then Laban keeps changing his wages and fighting with him. And finally, his wives say, let's get out of here. So they head back to the land of promise, and Laban comes after him with a whole bunch of men to form a law court and take him to trial. And it's brother-brother conflict. But God appears to Laban and says, you're a dead man if you mess with my servant Jacob. And so Laban has to go back. And so then Jacob comes to the border of the promised land, and Esau has come out with 400 men. Usually you don't come out with 400 men just to say hello. So Jacob's pretty worried about that. And then we come to the story of Joseph. More stuff about Jacob. We'll return to him in a minute. We come to the story of Joseph and of Judah. And what is that story about? It's about intermarrying with the women in another culture. The first story we read is the story of Judah and how he goes down and hangs around with the Canaanites and marries a daughter of a Canaanite, and God starts killing his sons, and then he gets involved with a Canaanite woman named Tamar, who is more righteous than he is, and it looks like it's going to be another disaster, but God brings grace out of that situation. And then we have the story of Joseph, and Joseph goes down into Egypt. And what does Potiphar's wife want from him? She wants, him to commit the sin of the sons of God with the daughters of men, and he refuses. But after the Egyptians are converted, then he's able to marry an Egyptian girl. So this story, the story of Jacob, shows us a successful negotiation with brother-brother strife, as we'll see in a minute. The story of Joseph shows us the proper way to intermarry with the pagans. Convert them and then marry. Okay? So that's where the Joseph story is going to fit in. Let's look back at the Abram story a little bit more. If we get these stories in mind, we'll see how they pile up and usher us into the Joseph story. Abram, there was a guy living in the city of Ur who was a prince. He was married to a girl whose name was Princess. That tells you that since she was his sister, he must have been a prince. And his father, Terah, must have been a prince of some sort of royalty in the city of Ur. These people were rich, obviously. They had lots of people in their retinue of servants. And this man, whose name was Stephen of Ur. And God appeared to Stephen of Ur one day and said, Steve, I want you to go to another land. I want you to leave here, and I want you to serve me And while we're at it, you can leave the moon god behind because I'm the only God you're ever going to need. I'm all the God you're ever going to need. So, and by the way, Stephen, I want you to stop calling yourself Stephen. I want you to call yourself Big Daddy. Abraham. And Stephen at first said, yeah, but, you know, my sister and I, half-sister and I have been married for 20 years and we don't have any kids yet. And the Lord said, trust me, from now on, your name is Abraham, Big Daddy. So Abram and his father decides to go along with him. They take a whole bunch of people along and they move part way to the promised land and they stop at a place called Haran for a while. And finally, when the older generation dies off, they move on into the promised land. You'll read that story again when we come out of Egypt. We stop in the wilderness when the older generation dies off and move into the promised land. So now Abram has moved into the promised land. Lots of people with him. He's got a personal army consisting of 318 fighting men. Scholars estimate that there might be as many as 3,000 people in Abram's sheepdom at this time. He moves into the promised land and he meets Mamre and Eshcol and these guys, and they say, oh, you're from Ur. You're one of those intellectual scholars who probably knows a lot about astronomy and stuff from Babylon. And you got all these people here with you. What's your name? Abraham. Oh, really? How many kids do you have? Well, none. But we've got high hopes. So there's a famine. And Abram and all of his people go down to Egypt. And the Pharaoh immediately wants to meet this prince from the city of Ur so they can talk about pyramid building and the stars and all the other stuff the Babylonians and the Egyptians were both interested in. So he meets him and he finds out that his sister is really a good-looking young thing, even at 65. So instead of negotiating for her, he grabs her and takes her into his palace. Now Abram has said beforehand, tell him you're my sister, don't tell him you're my wife. Because if these people think you're my wife, they may kill me. And what's that going to mean for these 3,000 people out here? Unprotected. It's not just me I'm thinking about. Trust me, dear, it's not just me I'm thinking about. I'm thinking about these people out here. We've got responsibilities. And so tell him you're my sister. Now, sometimes people say, come on. Is it really serious for Abram to worry about being murdered for the sake of his beautiful wife? Well, why don't you tell me? Who's read the Iliad? And what did the Greeks fight the Trojan War over? Because the Trojans stole a pretty wife. And when we read the Iliad, the first book of the Iliad, what do we find the Greek armies doing? It's going around stealing all the pretty girls. Just grabbing them. That's what people in the ancient world did. And that's what starts the whole drama of the Iliad. Because Agamemnon has stolen the daughter of a priest of Apollo, and so the gods are mad at the Greeks, and they send a plague upon the Greek army, remember? And so the father of Chrysis comes and says, I want my daughter back. And Agamemnon says, I don't want to give her back. And Achilles says, look, all the men are dying. You're going to have to give her back. He says, okay, I'll give her back, but I'm going to take your squeeze, Achilles. And he takes Briseis away from Achilles. Achilles sulks in his tent, and that begins the drama of the Iliad. But what Homer, when all of his intelligence and insight shows us, the Greeks are no better than the Romans. They all go around grabbing any pretty girl they can get and murdering if they have to do it. So Abraham's worry is very real, you see. This is the ancient world. Well, Abram gets out of there, you remember that God delivers him, and he comes back and he fights the war with the other men, and God appears to him and says, in 400 years, your descendants will possess this land. And Abram still doesn't have any kids, and Sarai is finally tired of all of this, Every time she gets out among the women, they say, oh, princess. And what's your husband's name? Oh, it's Prince Big Daddy. How many kids do you have? Oh, we don't have any yet. I don't seem to have been able to have any. So she can't stand it anymore. She says, Abram, take my maid Hagar, and when her baby is born, we'll take the baby and put it on my knee, and it'll be as if it was born from me. That's what this means, you see. This is where babies come from, guys. Okay? So you take the baby out, and you put it on my knee, and then it'll be my baby. But when the baby comes, that doesn't happen. And so it turns out to be a problem. Now, in chapter 17, we read that when Abram was 99 years old, God appeared before him and said, I am God Almighty. And he said, I don't want you to call yourself Big Daddy anymore. I want you to call yourself Maximum Dad. Abraham, it is in Hebrew. Abraham. Oh, please, don't do this, Lord. Now on, you're going to be Maximum Dad. This is even worse. I thought you were going to give me a great name. It said in chapter 12, I will make your name great. You've made my name ridiculous. Everybody laughs at me. In spite of the fact that more and more people seem to be coming to church at my altars. How's this working? Well, you remember I told you God had focused all of his attention on having a son. God had focused his attention on worship at altars. Abraham passes the test, so to speak. He is willing to worship God even at the cost of everything, and give up his son Isaac. And he says, as they go to sacrifice Isaac, he tells the men, you'll remember, I and the young man will go out to worship, and we will come back to you. Because Abraham knew that God would have to raise Isaac from the dead, because God had promised that the descendants would come from Isaac. So that means Abraham knows faith in the resurrection. His faith has grown to that point. But the point I want to make with you is in the next chapter. When Sarah dies, Abraham wants to find a place to bury her. And that's in chapter 23. And it says Abraham went to mourn for Sarah and to weep for her. In verse 3, Abraham, Maximum Dad, rose from his dead and spoke to the sons of Heth, saying, I'm a stranger and a sojourner among you. Give me a burial site, that I may bury my dead out of my sight. And the sons of Heth answered Abraham and said to him, Now, God said, I will make your name great. They said, Hear us, my Lord, you are God's prince among us. Now, all of a sudden, that ridiculous name, these guys weren't really thinking about that. They were thinking about how he led them to the Lord. You are God's prince among us. Bury your dead in the choicest of our graves. None of us will refuse you the grave for burying your dead. We can't do enough for you. So, God, this business of making a great name comes true at the end in spite of all the difficulties along the way. That's God's way a lot of times, is to put the gospel in a state of humiliation, to where the gospel appears to be terribly humiliated. At the same time, God is secretly growing the influence of the gospel in the world. Well, that's a sermon in itself. But now if we move from Abraham's story, we move from this story where Abraham comes to have faith in the resurrection. Abraham's whole life is about having a son. We get to Jacob. Jacob doesn't have any problem having sons. He just has one after another. It's like that problem has been solved. The problem in his life is two twins fighting each other. And in the ancient world, and in the tribal world, even today, it may have stopped everywhere in the world as a result of missionaries and colonialism. Evils of colonialism. But if twins are born, you put them both to death, or you at least put one of them to death. And the reason why is that everybody knows twins will grow up and fight. And what happens when two men fight? What does everybody else around do? They gather around and take sides. So when two brothers fight, you'll find people over here, and it will spread into the community, and you'll have terrible social strife. And people know this from experience. And this is the potential problem with Jacob and Esau. And missionaries go and they read this story. The first story that they read is the story of Abraham, and how Abraham leaves one place and goes to another place, and apparently is never homesick. Nobody in the pagan world can do that. In the Odyssey, what does Odysseus want to do? He just wants to get home. Where the water tastes like water. Where the cheese tastes like cheese. Where the minerals in the soil make everything taste the way he's used to having it taste. Where everything smells the way it smelled when he was growing up. He can't get out. Now there's a new movie based on Shakespeare's play Coriolanus, which has exactly the same theme. Coriolanus leaves Rome, and he can't stand it. Okay? Pagan man cannot leave a place and go to another. And that's the amazing thing about the Abraham. We're so used to it. I mean, we live in America, we're all Abrahams. We're all moving around, and, we don't have much of this experience. Well, then the pagans hear this story about Jacob and Esau, and how can this work out? Are you crazy? They're already fighting in the womb. How is this going to work out? We don't even perceive that the problem here. We're happy if we have twins. We don't expect twins to go up and murder each other. But this story shows this is where it starts. And Esau is determined to murder Jacob, and Jacob goes to another land, and Jacob comes, and God puts in Jacob's mind that he is going to inherit everything. God told him in the beginning, through his mother, you're going to inherit everything. And Isaac is determined not to give it to Jacob, isn't he? He wants to give it to Esau. He wants to give all of the inheritance to Esau. Remember why? Because he liked Esau's food. We're back in some Garden of Eden motifs here. He picks the wrong tree, the wrong food, and God has said Jacob is the one to inherit. Well, when Rebekah tricks Isaac on that night when she decides to try and bring him to his senses, and that's really what's going on here. Isaac puts his hand on the person he thinks is Esau and says, I give it all to you. I don't just give you the double portion, I give it all to you. This is terrible. He intends to take everything away from Jacob. How old were Jacob and Esau when that happened? How long had this been going on? They were 77 years old. Jacob was 77 when he went to get a wife. He was 84 when he got married. He was 97 when he wrestled the angel coming back into the land. All you have to do is add the numbers up in Genesis, and there's no doubt about it. So Jacob has been patient for 77 years, and his father has been undermining him all this time. Mother and father have been at odds with each other. And Jacob, as a result of Rebekah's trick, Isaac wakes up and says, okay, I give up. We have to look at this story of Rebekah a little bit. Have you taught on this? Okay. People read the story of Rebekah deceiving Isaac and they think, well, she shouldn't have done that. Yes, she should have. God has said how things were supposed to be, and her husband was in sin. Now, I want you to hear how this story starts. It's bizarre. All right? It came about, this is chapter 27. It came about when Isaac was old, his eyes were too dim to see, his eyes are going bad. That's a sign. Okay. No discernment. He called his older son Esau and said to him, my son. And he said to him, here am I. And Isaac said, behold, I'm old, I don't know the day of my death. Please take your gear, your quiver, and your bow, and go out in the field and hunt game for me, and prepare a savory dish for me, such as I love. And Rebekah was listening while Isaac spoke to his son Esau. Now, that's the magic verse, isn't it? Isaac calls Esau into his tent, and Rebekah just happens to be there. During that 1 2-minute span of time, during that 1 hour, on that one day, out of that 1 month, out of that 1 year, when this might have happened, she just happens to be there. I don't think she was standing outside the tent 24 hours a day waiting for something to happen. This is providential. And when she hears about this, she determines to trick her husband into blessing Jacob. Now she knows full well there's nothing magical about this blessing, and so does Esau. After Esau had mistakenly blessed Jacob, he could have said, Jacob, come back in here. I hereby curse you. I take it back, and I'm going to give it to Esau. These people didn't believe in magic. If Joe Blow had walked in off the street and gotten the blessing, it wouldn't have mattered. It wouldn't have been actually given to him. And so this narrative has nothing to do with Jacob being blessed. It's in chapter 28. Isaac called Jacob and blessed him and charged him and said. When the book of Hebrews in chapter 11 says, by faith Isaac blessed Jacob, this is what it refers to. Rebekah's point was to wake her husband up. Now this is important because Joseph is going to do the same thing later on. And if this was wrong, then it was Joseph. Joseph was wrong to do it. And if it's wrong to engage in this type of deception, then Nathan was wrong to come in and tell a bunch of lies to David about a rich man who killed a little sheep. And Jesus was wrong to trick those two people on the road to Emmaus and not tell them who he was. No. This is a matter of having a short-term deception in order to reveal the truth, in order to put somebody in a position. It's like a parable. It's like what Nathan did with David when he told him the story about the rich man who killed a little ewe lamb. And he says, "You're the man." Okay. David didn't say, "Well, you lied to me." That's not the way it works. So you should understand, Rebecca, the word means blessing. The Hebrew word for blessing is barak, and rebek is just that, turned around. Okay? You just switch the letters around from barak to rebek, and you got her name, which means blessing, and that's what she is. She's one of the heroes. No matter what all the male written commentaries have to say about it. So Jacob is sent away, and Laban tries to trick him, and he has to wrestle with Laban, and he comes back and he wrestles with the angel. He's been wrestling with people all of his life. And God says to him after he's wrestled with the angel, he says, "You have wrestled with God and with men, and you have prevailed." That's in chapter 32:28. Your name will no longer be Jacob, but God's wrestler, because you have striven with God and with men and have prevailed. You've striven with God and you have prevailed. Now how is that possible? How can we be Calvinists and believe it is possible for a man to prevail in a wrestling match with God? Only if God puts himself down on our level and says, "I'm wrestling with you." You see, what he's saying to Jacob is, "I've been wrestling with you the whole life. You thought you were wrestling with Esau in the womb. It was me. You thought you were wrestling with your father. It was me. You thought you were wrestling with Laban. It was me. I've been wrestling with you to make you strong. And now you're strong enough to come into the promised land and take dominion over it. And just so that you can really take dominion, I'm going to give you a limp to where you can't run anymore. And if a sheep runs away, you can't get it." Now, I don't know what kind of dominion that is when you can't run anymore. It's another kind of dominion. It's the kind that has to be exercised by voice alone. New kind of dominion. No, it's one thing to say, I've got dominion over this, I can grab hold of it and I can work it around. It's another thing to say, I'm stuck in a wheelchair and I'm just going to try to tell somebody else to do it, and they might or might not do it. Tougher kind of dominion to exercise by persuasion and wisdom. That's Jacob's new phase in life. And now he's moving out, and like we said, Esau came out with 400 men. And Jacob sends him all this stuff. And he comes across the river and he bows down. Esau ran to meet him and embraced him and fell on his neck and kissed him, and they wept. What? Something's happened during the last 20 years. Esau's a changed man. He says, "Man, I brought these 400 guys out here to escort you. Let's live together, you and me, Jacob and Esau, side by side the way it always should have been." Jacob says, "No, we have different destinies, but we'll get together at Christmas and Thanksgiving, all right? We can stay in touch by email, we'll Twitter each other, or tweet. Whatever that is. Okay? But Esau's a changed man. Nothing in the New Testament that says, Jacob I loved and Esau have I hated, as it is written, the elder will serve the younger. That's all that hate means. So Jacob has got come into the land. Everything is going to be good. And his daughter Dinah, Princess Dinah, these are princely people with lots of people. Princess Dinah goes out to visit the other princesses of the land, and Prince Hamor thinks she's so cute he can't resist her, and then you have this disastrous situation in chapter 34 where Simeon and Levi talk the men of Shechem into circumcising themselves and then murder them all while they're incapacitated. And God says, "You made these people into your covenant brothers, and then you slaughtered your covenant brothers. And so I'm going to cut you out of the covenant. You will not be allowed to have any land to inherit in the land of promise. You murdered these people in their land, so I'm not going to give you any land." That's in Genesis 49. This is pretty serious stuff, and that's going to be resolved later on in history, much later. But the thing I want us to see as we draw this lecture to a close is something about Joseph, because Joseph is going to give us this third story. Joseph is not going to have to worry about having children. When he gets married, he has children. In fact, he has twins. But they don't grow up and fight each other anymore because that problem's been solved. And Jacob is not going to have to worry about, working for an inheritance and having his salary changed constantly and all the rest of it. It's just going to fall into his lap when the time is right. In fact, he'll be a ruler. No, with Joseph, the test is going to be different. With Joseph, the test is going to be, God promises him he's going to be a ruler, and then he turns him into a slave over and over again. How frustrating can that be? And how patient do you have to be to bear up under that? What I want you to see is in Genesis chapter 29. You needn't turn here. I'm sure you remember these stories. But Jacob loved Rachel. He says, I will serve 7 more years for Rachel. And so then a week later, he's allowed to take Rachel to his wife. Okay. So, now, verse 31 of chapter 29. Yahweh saw that Leah was hated. See, Leah. Which girl was older, Rachel or Leah? Leah. Which girl had been married first? Leah. Which one was supposed to be first wife? Leah. But who was first wife? Rachel. You see. So that's what it means. The elder is set aside for the younger. That's all it means when it says Leah was hated. He kept on sleeping with her and had one child after another and finally a daughter. He buries her in the family plot. He loved her. He loved Rachel more. When it says Leah was hated, all it means in this context is she was counted as second. And Yahweh saw that Leah was hated, and he opened her womb, but Rachel was barren. Leah conceived and bare a son and named him Reuben, because the Lord has seen my affliction. Surely now my husband will love me. See, she confesses Yahweh. Then she conceived again and bore a son and said, because Yahweh has heard that I am hated, he has therefore given me this son. So she called him Shimeon. And she conceived again and bore a son and said, now this time my husband will love me. Okay, he'll become attached to me because I've borne him 3 sons. Therefore he was called attached. Levi. And she conceived again and bore a son and said, this time I will just praise Yahweh. No longer any great expectations in her husband. Therefore she named him Judah, and she stopped bearing. Now this is, if you give about 18 months or so for each child, this is about 6 or 7 years into the marriage. And we know the date of that. Now we continue in the next chapter, and it says Rachel saw that she didn't have any children, and so she gave her maid Bilhah, and she gave a couple of sons. And then when Leah saw that she stopped bearing, so this is after the 7-year mark, she gives her handmaid Zilpah, and she has a couple of wives. And then Leah starts having children again, and she has 2 more. And then in verse 22, all the way down at the end of this chapter, it says, God remembered Rachel, and God gave heed to her and opened her womb, and she conceived and bore a son, and said, God has taken away my reproach. So she named him Joseph, saying, may Yahweh give me another. Joseph means add. May God add another to me. Well, God will add another, Benjamin, but it will come at the cost of her life later on. All right? You remember that. Now, when did this happen? We read this chapter and we think Joseph must have been the last one born. But that's not the way the passage is written. He is the miracle son. So you have the normal sons and you have the miracle son. Now I know that he's not the last one born because all we have to do is look at the chronology. And I'm not going to do this. This is your homework. But if you look at Jacob comes down into Egypt when he's 137 years of age, and Joseph is 39 years of age, and you can calculate that back, and you will see that Joseph and Judah are pretty much the same age. Joseph and Judah are probably the same age, and they are twinned out in the narrative. Now you have to put some passages together and put the years together to see that. But several of the children were younger than Joseph, especially Dinah. And again, if you look at the chronology, when Joseph is taken down into Egypt, Benjamin has not been born. And Rachel is still alive. And so it's while his brothers are down in Egypt years later, he overhears them talking about the younger brother and the death of his mother. That's all news to him. And that's why he wants to see Benjamin. All of this stuff you can only get if you put the chronology together. Now, the trick is that these stories, these historical events, are written in narrative arcs that overlap each other. So the story of Jacob goes down to the rape of, the seduction, forcible seduction of Dinah when she's 14 or 15 years old. Remember, we just talked about that, and the men of Shechem. Prince Hamor has his way with Princess Dinah. Jacob's already gone by this time. Joseph's already gone by this time. Okay. Because Joseph was 17 when he was sold off to the Egyptians. And so Joseph had been sold into Egypt 2 or 3 years before this happened. Then we read on that Jacob goes to Bethel, and Deborah, Rebekah's nurse, dies. And then in verse 16 of chapter 35, they journeyed from the house of God, and when they were still some different distance to go from Ephrath, Rachel began to give birth, and she suffered severe pain. She had difficulty in giving birth. I will greatly multiply your sorrows in childbearing. This is one of the ways in which this happens. And it came about when she was in severe labor, the midwife came and said, "Don't fear, for now you have a son," in answer to your prayer. And it came about as her soul was departing, for she died, she named him the son of my sorrow. But his father called him son of my right hands, Ben-Yamin. Okay? So Rachel died and was buried on the way to Ephrath, which is Bethlehem. And Jacob set up a pillar over her grave, that is the pillar of Rachel's grave to this day. All right? All of this is after Joseph has been sold down into Egypt. Chapter 36 gives us the descendants of Esau, and chapter 37 then moves back in time to where Joseph is maybe 15 or 16 years old, and Jacob decides to honor him. This is shortly after they've come back into the promised land. And of the older sons, Jacob recognizes that Joseph is a lot like him. As we close, let's ask ourselves about the character of Jacob and Esau. Esau was the crown prince, right? He liked to go out hunting. So he'd hop on his antelope, or whatever he rode, zebra, and go out, shoot, hunt, bring all that gamey food in. What did Jacob do? He was a man of flocks. He kept the books. Oh, this is Jacob, the Jew. Laboring over the books. How many sheep now? Yeah. Triple entry bookkeeping. And so which one of them is exercising dominion? Oh yeah, Jacob is the one exercising dominion. He's the one who knows about speckle and stripe rods and all this kind of stuff. He can think, and he's keeping all the accounts. He knows everything where it is. And Esau doesn't know anything about going out and getting food. Okay, hunting around. He's not taking dominion at all, at least not in the early part of his life. So Jacob looks at his sons, and there's Reuben and Simeon and Levi. They haven't done bad things yet. They will. And then there's Judah. But Israel loved Joseph more than all his sons. He is drawn to him as someone who is like him. And so he puts him in charge of keeping the accounts and finding out what's going on. Because he suspects that when the brothers are out there pasturing the sheep around, they're helping themselves to sheep every now and then. And helping themselves to old goat every now and then, Not keeping the books the way they should. Maybe having a party with some of the local girls. And he suspects them, but he knows Joseph he can trust. So he puts Joseph in charge of keeping the count. And they resent him for it. They resent him even more because of his coat. But we're going to take a break now for a few minutes while you buy books. and snack, and then we'll come back and we'll have another 45 minutes or so.
Mac or